My husband Tyler finally came to visit me at the psychiatric hospital after all those years. When his eyes met mine, he just stood there, frozen in disbelief. But little did he know, the real shock was yet to come. I remember that moment so clearly, like a photograph etched in my mind, the stark white walls of the hospital corridor, the antiseptic smell that never quite went away, and Tyler's expensive suit that seemed so out of place in this sterile environment. The look on his face told me everything I needed to know. He had expected to find a broken woman, someone he could still control. Instead, he found me, stronger than ever before, with a clarity that must have terrified him. I could feel my heart pounding against my chest as I watched him, but this time it wasn't from fear, it was from the anticipation of what was about to unfold. The tables were about to turn in ways he never could have imagined. Years of manipulation and deceit were about to come crashing down around him, and I was finally ready to reclaim what he had taken from me. I had spent so many days in this place, watching the world go by through barred windows, but now I was about to show him that the woman he had tried to break was very much alive and ready to fight back.
Tyler sat on the edge of the bed, gazing absently at the city lights streaming through the window, his silhouette casting long shadows across the luxurious penthouse apartment. His life had become a far cry from the dream he'd once envisioned, a bitter mockery of his ambitious youth. The debt continued to mount and the business he had started years earlier went under. His marriage to Christina had once been his haven and support, but now it felt suffocating. Christina's inheritance from her mother, which had once seemed like his salvation, remained tantalizingly out of reach, locked away behind legal barriers and his wife's signature. But that wouldn't last forever, he thought, his jaw clenching as the wheels of desperation turned in his mind. Since her mother's death, Christina had fallen into a deep depression, becoming a ghost in their home, barely speaking, barely existing. There was no trace of the vibrant woman he once knew, and her spirit was feeble. As she grew weaker, Tyler's frustration mounted, a dangerous tide rising within him. She was the key to the fortune, but he couldn't allow her to remain an obstacle indefinitely. At that moment, a dark thought occurred to him. The only solution is to have her committed, he whispered to the empty room, the words hanging heavy in the air. He could easily argue that Christina was incapable of making decisions for herself. The doctors would believe his concerns about her mental state and the risk of self-harm. With a few signatures on the right documents, the inheritance would fall into his waiting hands. And then there was Ava, with her dangerous smile and intoxicating aura of freedom. She possessed everything Christina lacked: youth, vitality, and a fearless spirit that matched his own ambition. With Ava, he could start fresh, break free from this life of monotony and failure. But first, Christina had to be removed from the equation. That night, Tyler stood before the bathroom mirror, studying his reflection with cold calculation. Dark eyes, stubbled jaw, and a face etched with exhaustion stared back at him. He'd come too far to turn back now. By the time Christina realized what was happening, it would be far too late.
I remember that morning all too well, how everything started just like any other day, yet it would become the beginning of my nightmare. I was sitting at our dining room table, my uncombed hair falling around my face, staring blankly out the window at nothing in particular. The breakfast plate in front of me remained untouched, just like it had been for so many mornings since Mom passed away. I felt Tyler's presence before I saw him, his footsteps soft on the hardwood floor as he approached with what I now know was feigned concern. He placed his hand gently on my shoulder, but even that gentle touch felt heavy with hidden intentions. Tyler spoke to me in that soft, patronizing tone he'd perfected, asking if we could talk for a moment. I barely looked at him, his voice seeming to come from somewhere far away, as if I were hearing it through a thick fog. "What is it?" I whispered, my voice weak and unfamiliar even to my own ears, my eyes still fixed on the table. Tyler sat down beside me, putting on a show of sympathy that I was too numb to question at the time. He started talking about how worried he was about me, about how I hadn't been myself since Mom died. His words dripped with honey-coated poison as he suggested I needed professional help. I just stared at him, my mind too foggy to fully comprehend what he was saying. Tyler continued, telling me he'd already spoken with some doctors, suggesting that maybe a short stay in a hospital would help me recover. His voice was gentle and persuasive, but now I know it masked a cold calculation I was too broken to recognize. I had no strength left to protest, no energy to question his motives. I was emotionally exhausted, too drained to even doubt the words of the man who had promised to love and protect me.
Tyler has cut Christina off from the outside world. Within days, he had arranged everything with cold efficiency, having a compliant doctor sign the necessary papers without so much as raising an eyebrow. Christina was committed to a psychiatric facility under the diagnosis of severe depression, her fate sealed with the stroke of a pen. The day she was taken, Tyler had a blank look on his face. He watched as Christina, her eyes vacant and hands trembling, was led into the waiting ambulance without uttering a single word. As the ambulance doors closed with a final, hollow thud, Tyler drew in a deep breath of satisfaction. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the curtain rising on his new life. Christina was now out of his way, removed from the equation like an unwanted variable, and the path to what he believed was rightfully his lay clear before him. With Ava by his side and the inheritance in his grasp, he could finally realize the lavish lifestyle they'd been fantasizing about. Yet deep in the darkest corners of his soul, Tyler knew he had crossed a line from which there was no return. He continued the path of the betrayer, but he tried desperately to ignore it. His perfectly manicured hands may have been clean, but his conscience was stained with the indelible marks of his treachery. And yet he pretended nothing happened, leaving Christina and his self-respect behind.
Those first few days in the psychiatric hospital felt like being trapped in a thick, suffocating fog. I couldn't really comprehend what had happened to me, how my life had taken such a devastating turn. The stark white walls seemed to close in around me, the nurses' whispers echoing through the halls, and their pitying glances following me everywhere I went. I remember lying in my narrow bed at night, asking myself over and over, how did I end up here? As weeks passed, my heart, already weakened by pain and betrayal, desperately searched for something, anything to hold on to. Tyler, my husband who had promised to stand by me in sickness and in health, never once came to visit. He simply vanished from my life as if our 20 years of marriage had been nothing but a dream. Locked away in this sterile prison without any answers, I began to fear that I might never leave these walls. I would lie awake at night wondering if anyone would ever come to help me, to save me from this nightmare. Days turned into months, and before I knew it, the years had flown by. Time lost all meaning in this place, where every day was exactly like the one before. The conversations with the doctors became a monotonous routine, empty words that led nowhere. Sometimes they would talk about my progress, but I knew in my heart I wasn't getting better. How could I when what was eating away at my soul wasn't depression at all? It was the bitter poison of my husband's betrayal that was slowly killing me inside.
During those long years, Tyler lived in decadent luxury with Ava, his newfound paradise built on the foundation of Christina's stolen inheritance. He indulged in every extravagance imaginable, squandering money on designer clothes, exotic cars, and lavish parties with reckless abandon. In his mind, everything was perfect, a testament to his clever manipulation and ruthless ambition. Yet as the champagne flowed and the credit cards maxed out, Ava's true nature began to reveal itself like frost creeping across a window pane. Her eyes, once filled with passionate fire, now held only the cold calculation of a woman who loved wealth more than the man who provided it. Ava's demands were increasing daily and money was fast disappearing. Ava's perfectly manicured hands were always outstretched, her ruby-red lips constantly forming new requests for more jewelry, more shopping sprees, more proof of Tyler's devotion to her insatiable appetite for luxury. Every kiss came with a price tag, every embrace was measured in dollar signs, and Tyler's once proud conquest was slowly transforming into his gilded cage. Yet he remained blind to the truth, desperate to believe that his betrayal of Christina had been worth the price of his soul.
I began to notice subtle changes happening around me in the hospital, realizing I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. My brother-in-law John started visiting me more and more frequently, becoming a steady presence in my isolated world. At first, I could sense his uncertainty about how to handle the situation, how to approach someone who seemed so broken. Though Tyler had told him nothing, John had his suspicions about my sudden hospitalization. I later learned that he kept wondering how a woman like me, who had always been so strong and resilient, could fall into such deep depression without any clear explanation. John had always known his brother Tyler's true nature, manipulative, ambitious, and coldly calculating. So during each visit, he made a point to really listen to me, to hear my story beneath the silence. No one else showed such genuine care and understanding as John did during those dark days. He would bring me books, little windows to the outside world, and share news about life beyond the hospital walls. Without my even realizing it at first, John was helping me reclaim my sense of time, of life itself. As months turned into years, I began to awaken from my fog of despair. It wasn't a physical awakening, but rather a spiritual one, my mind slowly clearing, my thoughts becoming my own again. I started to understand exactly what had happened to me, to see the manipulation for what it was. Though the pain of betrayal still cut deep, I finally stopped pitying myself. Instead, I began quietly forming plans, thinking ahead to the day I would leave this place. I made a silent promise to myself: when I got out, I would rebuild my life from the ground up.
Meanwhile, Tyler remained oblivious to Christina's awakening as he continued his relentless march toward destruction. His investments failed one after the other, and Ava grew tired of his unfulfilled promises and dwindling fortunes. Day by day, she began to distance herself from him, her passionate embraces turning cold as winter frost. What had started as a fiery affair was now disappeared. Tyler, desperate not to lose her, threw himself into satisfying her every whim and desire. But the more he tried to please her, the worse his life became. Then came the day when Tyler returned home to find nothing but a brief note on the polished mahogany dining table. Ava had left him without a goodbye, without an explanation. She had simply grown tired of the game. He stood alone in his luxurious penthouse, surrounded by expensive furnishings he could no longer afford to keep. The phone calls from creditors rang repeatedly. He was buried under ever-growing debts. All the pretenses he had built began to crumble. The empire he had sacrificed his soul to build was dissolving before his eyes, leaving him with nothing but the bitter taste of defeat.
During those challenging times, my relationship with John grew deeper and more meaningful with each passing day. He became my anchor, staying by my side and supporting me in ways that slowly rekindled the flame of hope I thought had been extinguished forever. John did more than just listen. He helped me rediscover the strength that had always been within me, buried beneath layers of pain and betrayal. One quiet afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the hospital window, I turned to John and told him I was ready. I remember my voice was steady when I said I'd had enough of this place and was prepared to start a new life. The smile that spread across John's face told me he'd been waiting for this moment, believing in me even when I couldn't believe in myself. With John's unwavering support, I was finally able to secure my release from the hospital. When I stepped out of those doors for the last time, after what felt like a lifetime, I was no longer the same broken woman who had entered years ago. The person who emerged was someone new, stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever before. I made a conscious choice not to let revenge consume me, though it would have been easy to give in to that burning desire. Instead, I focused my energy on reclaiming the life that had been stolen from me, on building something new from the ashes of what I'd lost. Looking back now, I realize that decision was the first step toward truly healing. I found a new purpose in life, something that gave meaning to all the pain I had endured. I began rebuilding my life by reaching out to other women who were suffering similar emotional abuse and manipulation. When I shared my story, I could feel the weight of truth in my words, and I watched as hope rekindled in the eyes of those who listened. Each person who found courage in my experience helped heal another small piece of my own heart. I was no longer chained to my past. Instead, I had transformed it into a bridge toward the future. I saw how my journey of recovery touched those around me, especially John, who had stood by me through the darkest times. John and I had grown to depend on each other in ways neither of us had expected. The love that blossomed between us felt as natural as the changing of seasons, impossible to deny or resist. As time passed, I could feel my inner strength returning, like a flower pushing through concrete to reach the sun. I was no longer that broken woman who had entered the psychiatric hospital all those years ago. I knew Tyler had no idea how much I had changed, how completely I had transformed. While he was sinking into his own destruction, he remained completely blind to the storm that was coming his way. Looking back now, I realize that sometimes the greatest victory isn't in revenge, but in becoming someone new, someone stronger.
Meanwhile, Tyler sat staring at the phone on his mahogany desk, its incessant ringing a constant reminder of the bank's demanding answers. The fortune he stole from Christina, which once seemed limitless, has now been spent. His foolish decisions, extravagant purchases, and decadent lifestyle with Ava had trapped him in an inescapable abyss of debt. Ava is gone now, abandoning him as he falls into destitution. His once cheerful friends now shunned him. No one wanted to associate with a man who had nothing left to offer, his former charm as worthless as Confederate currency. He no longer heard the false praise and he felt defeated every day. Every attempt to salvage the fragments of his luxurious life ended in humiliating failure. His pride, still as formidable as ever, prevented him from acknowledging that he was teetering on the edge of complete destruction. Even as foreclosure notices began arriving like autumn leaves, Tyler continued to reassure himself that everything would be fine. He kept muttering about needing just one more chance, one more deal to turn things around. But deep down, he knew the truth: disaster was inevitable. The empire he had built on betrayal was crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide.
As Tyler's world crumbled, I found myself growing stronger with each passing day. Working alongside John, I began consulting with legal experts, carefully building our case to reclaim what Tyler had stolen from me. I was no longer the frightened woman he had locked away. I had become someone who understood her worth and was ready to fight for justice. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Tyler had tried to break me by putting me in that hospital, it had become the very place where I had found my strength. With John's steady support and guidance, we methodically gathered evidence and built a solid legal strategy. I remember sitting at the lawyer's office, my hand steady as I signed the documents that would start the process of reclaiming my inheritance. Every step we took felt like another brick being removed from the wall Tyler had built around me. I knew this wouldn't be an easy battle, but for the first time in years, I felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead.
On an ordinary morning that would prove anything but ordinary, Tyler received news that shattered his carefully constructed world. The official notice, printed on stark legal letterhead, stated that proceedings had begun to return the stolen inheritance to its rightful owner. At first, Tyler's mind refused to process the emotions. In his arrogance, he had convinced himself that Christina was nothing more than a ghost from his past, forever locked away in his carefully orchestrated prison. He sat on the edge of the bed and checked the papers several times. And yet, no matter how many times he read it, he didn't want to believe what the words meant. Thus began the trial that would determine not just the fate of the inheritance, but the very course of both their futures. Justice began, and for the first time Tyler was overwhelmed by its ruthlessness.
I sat in the courtroom, my heart pounding as I listened to Tyler's lawyer paint me as mentally unstable and incapable of managing my own inheritance. His lawyer spoke in a gentle yet venomous tone, claiming Tyler had only ever acted to protect me. They argued that my supposed mental condition made me unfit to manage the disputed assets, suggesting that Tyler should maintain control for the family's best interests. Under the table, I clenched my fists so tight my knuckles turned white. Every word from his lawyer was a carefully crafted lie, part of Tyler's scheme to maintain complete control over my life. Even then, in that crucial moment, they were trying to strip me of what was rightfully mine. But my lawyer wasn't about to let that happen. He had meticulously prepared his cross-examination, determined to expose Tyler's carefully constructed facade. My lawyer began speaking in a calm voice filled with unwavering conviction, explaining to the judge how I had overcome numerous hardships over the years. He revealed how Tyler had manipulated my good faith to wrongfully control my assets. While acknowledging my past mental health struggles, my lawyer emphasized my recovery and, most importantly, my right to make decisions about my own property. As his words echoed through the courtroom, I could see Tyler's face becoming rigid with tension. With each argument my lawyer presented, I felt my strength growing. I was determined never to let anyone take away my rights again. The trial proceeded with both sides presenting evidence and arguments, while Tyler stood there speechless, watching his control slip away. My lawyer's voice grew stronger as he declared that I was a victim of manipulation and abuse. He explained how Tyler had falsely claimed I was incapable of making sound decisions, using that as justification to have me committed against my will. The courtroom fell silent as my lawyer revealed that this was all part of Tyler's scheme to control both my assets and my life. Everyone listened intently as he continued to expose Tyler's manipulative behavior and true intentions. He revealed how Tyler had maintained a relationship with his mistress Ava, while keeping me confined in the hospital. The financial records and frozen accounts provided irrefutable evidence that Tyler's actions were never about protecting me, but about stealing my rights. I watched Tyler squirm uncomfortably in his seat across from me, knowing the evidence against him was overwhelming. With each word my lawyer spoke, I could see Tyler's carefully constructed plan crumbling before his eyes. My lawyer concluded by stating unequivocally that I was fully capable of managing my own assets. He declared that this trial was nothing more than Tyler's last desperate attempt to maintain his years of control over me. I took a deep breath, feeling both relieved and angry as I listened to these words. Everything I had endured, everything Tyler had done to me, was finally being brought into the light. Finally, the truth I had kept silent for so long was about to see the light of day. When Tyler's turn came to speak, I watched as he put on his familiar act of righteousness. He claimed he had only wanted what was best for me, his voice straining for its old persuasive power. He insisted that I had been mentally ill and needed his help, that he had only acted as any husband would. He complained that it was unfair to question his behavior now, and that all he wanted was for us to be happy. But his words rang hollow now, stripped of their former power over me. I listened calmly as his lies only served to dig him deeper into the hole he'd made for himself. During the recess, while we waited for the verdict, Tyler approached me with his old intimidation tactics. He whispered in that contemptuous voice, asking if I really thought I could win. I met his gaze steadily, no longer affected by his attempts to frighten me. I told him quietly but firmly that I wasn't afraid of him anymore, that I had found my freedom the moment I stopped believing his lies. I saw him step back, startled by this new woman standing before him, so different from the vulnerable one he thought he knew. When the judge returned, the courtroom fell silent. The verdict was clear and unequivocal. The judge declared that the evidence clearly showed Tyler's years of psychological manipulation and his baseless attempts to seize my property. The court granted me full control of all my property and assets. The judge added that Tyler should be held accountable for fraud and spousal abuse. I watched as Tyler's face contorted with rage, everything he had meticulously planned for years crumbling before his eyes. He had nowhere left to run. I felt an indescribable sense of liberation wash over me. This wasn't just about winning a court case. I had reclaimed my freedom and my life. I looked at John, seeing his proud smile, and I knew there would still be challenges ahead, but this time I would face them without chains or betrayal. Tyler had been transformed from my greatest fear into something powerless, no longer able to control my life.
Tyler wandered aimlessly through the city streets, feeling the ground crumbling beneath his designer shoes that were now scuffed and worn. His once immaculate suit hung wrinkled and stained on his frame, a perfect reflection of his disintegrating life. The judge's final words echoed in his mind. He had lost everything, not just the inheritance he'd coveted in court, but the mask of respectability he'd hidden behind for years. No longer was he the powerful man who commanded respect and fear, now he was left with nothing but solitude and a world that was crumbling around him. He stopped in front of a real estate office, staring at listings for properties he once owned. All his wealth had vanished, squandered on extravagance in his lavish life with Ava. Even the apartment he'd tried to steal from Christina was beyond his reach now. Looking at his reflection in an empty storefront window, he whispered to himself, asking what he had become. The cold wind whipped against his face, a harsh reminder that the world he once ruled had turned its back on him. His old friends, who once respected and feared him, now ignored his desperate calls for help. Those who once rushed to fulfill his every whim now crossed the street to avoid him. In his desperation, Tyler sought refuge in the upscale bar where he used to drink with Ava. He slumped onto a bar stool, ordered a bottle, and drained it quickly. In his mind, a voice kept whispering that he was nobody now. He remembered how he used to walk into this same bar with a confident smile, knowing every eye would turn to him with respect. Now, even the bartender didn't recognize him, he had become a ghost, someone everyone preferred to forget. Days passed, and Tyler couldn't find his way out of the darkness. His mind spiraled deeper into despair and destructive habits. He spent his last dollars on alcohol and gambling, desperately believing he could somehow reclaim what he'd lost. But luck had abandoned him completely. As weeks went by, his appearance deteriorated further. Dark circles formed under his eyes, insomnia plagued his nights, and endless guilt consumed him. Without home, job, or family to turn to, he was truly alone. One day, in his desperate search for help, he accidentally encountered John on the street. The sight of his brother filled him with a mixture of rage and jealousy. The younger brother he had once despised now walked with confidence, while his own life lay in ruins. "John, wait," Tyler called out, his voice trembling as he stumbled forward. John stopped, shocked by his brother's deteriorated state, feeling a mix of pity and resignation. He knew helping Tyler would be pointless, his brother had chosen this path himself. Still, John decided to give him one last chance to speak, one final moment of grace. "What do you want, Tyler?" John asked pointedly. Tyler's voice trembled with mingled regret and desperation as he begged for help, explaining that everything had fallen apart. He pleaded that he had nowhere else to go, reminding John that he had always been the sensible one, begging for one more chance. John stood silently, studying the broken man before him as memories of everything Tyler had done to Christina flashed through his mind. The lies, the manipulation, every calculated attempt to destroy her, it all came rushing back. Yet somewhere deep inside, John couldn't completely extinguish the last ember of pity for his brother. A small part of him still wanted to help Tyler, the brother he once knew. But he also knew Tyler would never change, he had squandered every chance he'd been given. With quiet resolve, John told him there was nothing more he could do for him. He reminded Tyler that he'd had countless opportunities to do the right thing, to protect his family. Instead, John continued, Tyler had chosen the opposite path. Now he would have to face the consequences of his actions. The words hit Tyler like physical blows, their truth undeniable despite the excuses that still lingered in his mind. He had always found ways to blame others, but now even his own brother wouldn't help him. John walked away without looking back, leaving Tyler alone in the gathering darkness. That night, Tyler wandered aimlessly through the city streets. The cold seeped through the holes in his worn coat, his body shaking uncontrollably. He had lost everything, not just money, but his dignity, his family, and any hope for the future. Finally, he stopped in front of the apartment building he had tried to steal from Christina. The irony struck him with brutal force. The place he had schemed to possess was forever beyond his reach, while the woman he had despised now owned everything he had lost. Tyler collapsed onto the sidewalk, but no one heard his anguished cries. No one even looked his way. He had become invisible, abandoned by everyone who had once known him. All he had left was the bitter certainty of his self-inflicted destruction. As rain began to fall on the city streets, Tyler finally understood. There was no going back, he was completely alone, and would remain so for the rest of his days.
After the storm of the trial had passed, I could finally breathe freely again. The judge's words still echoed in my mind, granting me full control of my assets and finding Tyler guilty of fraud and abuse. This wasn't just a legal victory, I had reclaimed my freedom and my life. With John, once my brother-in-law, and now my partner, by my side, I began piecing together the life that Tyler had nearly destroyed. The time in the hospital, the manipulation, the lies, being treated as if I were helpless, all of that now felt like a distant memory. I refused to remain a prisoner of that pain any longer. I wanted to live a pain-free life. After the trial, my first project was renovating the apartment, the same one Tyler had tried to steal, the place that had once felt like my prison. I was determined to transform it into my sanctuary, a starting point for my new life. One afternoon, while looking through furniture catalogs, I told John the first wanted to completely remake this place. I didn't want to keep anything that reminded me of my time with Tyler. This would be a home where we could build our happiness. John looked at me with pride in his eyes, having witnessed my transformation from a broken woman to someone who got stronger with each challenge. The days passed, and the apartment began to change. I poured myself into every detail, from the color of the walls to the smallest decorative items. Each decision I made was an assertion of my independence, proof that I could control my own life again. Sometimes in the quiet of night, the pain of the past would try to creep back in, but I refused to let those memories defeat me. As months passed, my life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Happiness filled the apartment and I enjoyed a long-awaited peace. John remained my rock, my partner in everything. Together, we were ready to face whatever the future might hold, knowing that this time, it would be on our own terms.
Meanwhile, in a distant corner of the city, Tyler remained submerged in his own misery, drowning in the consequences of his actions. He had lost not only the two women who had played pivotal roles in his life, Christina, whom he had betrayed, and Ava, who had betrayed him, but also any chance at redemption. His once proud empire had crumbled to dust, leaving him alone with the bitter knowledge that he had orchestrated his own downfall. Like a fallen king stripped of his crown, he wandered the streets, haunted by the ghosts of his past choices and the crushing weight of irredeemable sins.
And for me, Tyler had become nothing more than a fading shadow from the past. I closed my eyes, feeling the warm sunlight streaming through my apartment windows, filling the living room with a gentle, golden glow. I had won not just in the courtroom, but in the greater battle for my life and freedom. That victory, the reclaiming of my soul and my future, was what truly mattered in the end. As I sat there basking in the afternoon light, I knew that this wasn't just an ending, it was my new beginning.